The document lay open on the drawing-room table, its edges weighted by 2 silver candlesticks, and by the particular silence of men who have already decided what the afternoon will produce. Pemberton Hale stood behind it, his thick fingers spread across its surface as though the paper required holding down, and he read aloud in the measured tones of a man accustomed to making legal language sound like the voice of Providence itself. The words he read described a death, a woman's death, a death that had occurred in this house, in this county, on a morning in November 10 years ago, with a physician present and the church record duly filed. Wren Bassett stood at the far wall with a tray she had not set down. She had carried it in 7 minutes ago and had not moved since, because her feet had stopped obeying her the moment Hale had unrolled that document and begun. She knew that document. She knew the handwriting on the margin annotation, which was not the physician's hand and never had been. She knew what the morning described in its language had actually contained, because she had been 15 years old and crouching in the passage behind the solar room door, and she had seen everything that truth required a witness to see. Reginald Caro sat beside Hale with a glass of Madeira and the expression of a man enjoying himself. Across the table, Edmund Caro, Earl of Ashwick, had his hands flat on the chair arms and his gaze fixed on the window. He was not watching the document. He had the look he always wore when his wife was invoked, closed, gray, removed, as though the only way to survive the mention of her was to be briefly absent from his own face. The pen lay waiting. Hale reached the final line, and the word rose in Wren's throat the way water rises in a well when pressure has been building underground for 10 years and can no longer be contained. She said, "Liar." The tray tilted. One of the cups slid and fell, and the sound of it striking the hearthstone was the only other sound in the room for what felt like a very long time. Every face turned toward her. Reginald's expression curdled from satisfaction into something colder. Hale looked up over his small wire spectacles with the blinking attention of a man who has just heard a noise he cannot categorize. The 2 solicitors' clerks near the window looked at each other. The Earl turned from the window and looked at her directly, perhaps for the first time in 2 years of her employment, and his gray eyes were entirely focused and entirely still. Wren Bassett, whom every person in that room believed incapable of speech, set the tilted tray carefully down on the nearest surface and said nothing else. She did not need to. The one word hung in the candlelit air of the drawing-room like a stone dropped into deep water, and the ripples were already moving. She had been 15 years old when she learned that silence was the only thing keeping her alive. She had been 24 when she came back. The house was called Ashwick Court, and it sat in the middle of the Wiltshire countryside the way old things sit in old places, carrying the certainty of permanence and the faint, persistent smell of damp that no amount of coal fires had ever fully dispelled. Wren had arrived 2 years prior in a carrier's cart, with a reference letter from a household in Bath that was genuine in every detail except her surname. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, had been desperate for steady hands. Wren had presented steady hands along with the ability to read and write and manage a household's upper-floor linens with the kind of quiet competence that required no direction. That her voice never came was noted in the first week and accepted by the second. The assumption of the staff was that she had always been this way. She did not correct it. She had not spoken in 10 years. Or rather, she had not spoken in any room where being heard could reach the wrong ears. The silence had begun as necessity and had settled over time into something heavier. It became her skin. It became the membrane through which she understood herself to move through the world, translucent, observable, but never quite reached. The house had changed since she was 15. New wallpapers in the upper corridors, a rebuilt kitchen passage, the portrait gallery reordered, the drawing room where everything had happened was still the drawing room, which was the part of returning that required most of her courage. She had walked into it her first week, alone, before the household was awake, and had stood at the center of it for a long time. She had made herself breathe slowly. She had studied the fireplace and the window and the table where the document had first been read to the late Lord Ashwick, Edmund's father, while a physician who had been paid very well for his cooperation stood to one side, and the dowager stood at the other, and Wren had watched from the passage with her hand over her mouth. Then she had walked out and gone upstairs to begin her work. And she had not gone back except when duty required. Clara found her on Wren's fourth morning in the house. The child appeared at the linen room door with a small notebook and a pencil and wrote in neat letters, "My name is Clara. Can you understand what I write?" Wren had looked at the notebook for a moment and then nodded, and something in Clara's face had shifted from the cautious hope of a child who has spent too much time alone into something warmer. That was how it began. By the end of Wren's first month, Clara was meeting her in the library after lessons to read together, the child's voice providing the narration that Wren followed on the page. By the end of her first winter, Wren had become the most reliable presence in Clara's world. She brought her toast with the crusts cut in the way Clara preferred. She sat with her during the thunderstorms that Clara would not admit frightened her. She tied her plates each morning with even tension, and answered every written question with a written answer of her own, and the two of them had built something that functioned very much like trust. She saw Edmund at a distance. He was 34 years old and moved through his own house as though he had not quite decided whether it belonged to him or whether he was simply occupying it on behalf of his grief. He was not cold in the way that men of his station were sometimes cold. The calculated coldness of rank performed. He was cold in the way of something that has been hollowed. He rose early. He rode when weather permitted. He attended to the management of his estate with meticulous care, and accepted no invitations to the county's social life, which had long since accepted this as his fixed nature and issued invitations anyway, out of what appeared to be politeness, and was in practice a desire to have something to discuss at dinner. He did not know that his first wife had been alive for 6 years after the document declared her dead. He believed, completely and without question, that she had died in November of 1805, and that the fault was partly his, because he had been in London in October and had not been present at her side. He carried that belief in the particular set of his jaw and in the way he went still whenever Clara laughed, as though joy were a thing that required bracing for. Wren watched him. It was not safe to feel anything about what she watched, and she did not permit herself to. She watched all the same. Reginald Carow arrived on a Wednesday in late October, which was the sort of day that felt thin-aired and preliminary, the light already considering departure by 3. In the afternoon, he drove up in a hired chaise with a trunk and 2 leather cases, and greeted his brother in the entrance hall with the particular warmth of a man who requires something. Wren was on the upper landing when they entered, and she went still against the wall to let them pass. Reginald looked up as he shrugged off his coat, not because he had noticed her, but because his eyes moved over a room the way water moves over stones, continuously cataloging surface without penetrating depth. He saw her. He registered the gray gown, the white collar, the absence of any expression, the chalk slate she carried at her side. "The dumb maid," he said to the footman beside him, not quietly. "Still here, is she? I thought my mother said she'd go." He handed over his coat and walked on. Wren descended the stairs at the measured pace of someone who has long practice in not reacting. Her hands were steady. She counted the steps, which she always did when she needed to find the floor beneath her feet. The business that had brought Reginald to Ashwick Court concerned a property called Meridew House in Somerset. It had belonged to Margaret Carow's father, and had been settled in the original marriage contract, on any female issue of the marriage. On Clara, it was a modest property, a moderate income, and represented the only inheritance Clara possessed that was not dependent on her father's continued management, a dower property, her own. Reginald had found a mechanism, through Hale, by which the property could be reclassified as part of the estate's entailed inheritance, on the grounds that Margaret's death record predated the settlement's activation clause. It required only Edmund's signature on a document confirming the date of Margaret's death, and his understanding of its implications. Edmund, who had seen his brother infrequently over the past decade, and who appeared to believe in his hollow-chested way that family obligations could be managed like ledger entries, had agreed to review the papers. He had not told Clara what they contained. Wren learned this from Mrs. Fenwick, who mentioned it as household information without attaching any particular significance to it. She learned it on the Monday. On the Tuesday, she lay awake until well past midnight. On the Wednesday, she was on the upper landing when Reginald arrived. She told herself she was watching. She told herself she had not yet decided. She had been telling herself this for 2 years. The library at Ashwick Court was long and low-ceilinged, with windows on the east side that admitted the first gray light of morning before the rest of the house had assembled itself for the day. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the fourth was hung with maps of the estate in different decades, the fields shifting their boundaries across the series as ownership's edges adjusted. It was Wren's favorite room in the house. She thought this was because it was full of things that could be read rather than spoken, and because the morning light in it was gentle and did not ask questions. She came there before her duties on the Thursday, as she sometimes did, with a natural history volume she had been working through in her private hours. Clara had asked about migration the previous week, and Wren had found a passage she wanted to read to her. She had not planned to read it aloud. It had simply happened. The room was empty. The light was gray and still. And the words were there on the page, and the silence she usually kept felt, in this particular morning, less like her skin and more like a coat she had forgotten she was wearing. She began to read quietly. Her voice, after 10 years of deliberate disuse, was lower than it had been at 15 and slightly rough, like something brought up from a great depth, but it shaped the words without difficulty. The passage concerned the Arctic tern, which migrates from one pole of the Earth to the other and back again every year of its life, crossing oceans, navigating by light and by some inner compass science had not yet named. She did not know he was standing in the doorway. She discovered it when she paused at the bottom of a page to find the continuation, and the peripheral movement of someone very still became impossible to ignore. She looked up. He was at the threshold, not inside the room, his hand flat on the doorframe, his coat still carrying the cold of wherever he had been before the library, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately interpret. He had been standing there long enough that the cold morning light from the east windows had found him and settled on him, and he did not move when she looked up, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had not asked. It was not anger. It was not the satisfaction of exposure. It was something closer to the expression he wore when Clara laughed, a bracing, as of someone who has not been prepared for what has arrived. She closed the book. The silence between them was nothing like the silence she kept. Professionally, it was alive. It had texture and weight and a temperature, and it was warm. He said nothing. He stepped back from the doorframe. He walked away down the corridor without looking back, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor diminished and was gone. And Wren sat in the library with the natural history book in her hands and her heart pressing against her ribs, in the quiet, steady way of something that has waited a long time to make itself known. She had told herself for 2 years that she felt nothing about this house, and the man who moved through it like a man apologizing for his own presence. It was Thursday morning when she understood that this was no longer true. Clara came to the library that afternoon, and Wren read to her from the Arctic tern passage, with her voice back behind its usual silence, communicated through the chalk slate. She kept the book. That evening, Edmund called Clara to the upper sitting room to look at something he had retrieved from the attic. It was a portrait, a small oval in an ornate frame, painted on ivory, the kind made for traveling or for a desk. It depicted a woman of perhaps 22, with light hair, and an uncertain expression that might have been modesty, or might have been fear. It was Margaret. Wren was in the passage, returning linens to the corridor chest, when she heard his voice through the half-open door. He said, "That is your mother, Clara. I thought you ought to have it downstairs." Clara received this with the particular solemnity of a 10-year-old processing significant information, and asked if her mother had been kind. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "She was lonely," he said finally. "And I was not a good husband to her. I was away too often, and when I came back, I was too busy with the estate to attend to her, as I should have." "I have thought about that a great deal," Clara said. "She looks sad in the portrait." "Yes," he said. "She does." Wren went still at the corridor chest with a folded sheet in her hands. The pain in his voice was not the pain of grief for a beloved wife. It was the specific pain of a man who knows he failed at something he could not go back and repair. She recognized it because she had been living with her own version of that pain for 10 years, and it had the same sound, quiet, precise, and entirely without exit. She pressed the sheet into the chest and closed the lid. At the county dinner that Friday, which Edmund attended because Lady Stanhope had pressed with particular persistence, and because Mrs. Fenwick had said it was good for Clara to see the house used, sociably, a woman named Mrs. Alderton referred to Wren as the deaf-mute when she asked Edmund, who had opened the door for her arrival. She said it with the easy carelessness of someone classifying a piece of furniture, neither malicious nor attentive, and Edmund corrected her in a level voice. "She is not deaf. She does not speak, Mrs." Alderton received this correction with a murmur of polite adjustment and moved on, and the conversation at the table carried forward as conversations at tables do, and no one gave it further attention. Wren, who had been serving the remove, had heard the correction. She had heard the level voice in which it was delivered. She did not permit herself to note what she felt about it. She returned to the kitchen with the empty dishes and stood at the scullery sink for a moment with the cold air from the yard on her face, breathing deliberately. The document was scheduled to be reviewed and signed on the following Monday. She had 4 days. She spent them in observation and in a fear that had been her oldest companion, and that she had long since learned to function alongside. It was not the fear of a child anymore. It was the fear of a woman who understood exactly what she had witnessed and exactly what it would cost to say so. Hale would deny it. Reginald would deny it. The dowager, Lady Dorothea, who had arrived Saturday in a carriage with her personal maid and the particular authority of a woman who has never been successfully contradicted, would deny it with the weight of a title and 40 years of social capital. Wren had no title. She had a reference letter with a false surname and a 10-year silence that could be rendered as evidence of instability by anyone who wished to render it that way. She had one thing they had not accounted for. She had the pewter brooch worn at the inside of her collar where it could not be seen. Margaret had pressed it into her hand on a morning in November through the solar room door that Wren had opened to bring the lady her breakfast. Margaret had been frightened and not well, and had said softly, "Take it and go, and do not tell anyone what you have seen today." She had said this before. The physician arrived before the document was signed. Before the declaration was made, she had known what was coming. The brooch was shaped like a small bird with spread wings. Wren had worn it against her skin for 10 years. On the Monday, Reginald assembled the drawing room for the signing, with the assurance of a man who has done the preparatory work correctly. The clerks were present. Hale was present, with his document and his spectacles and his voice, like propriety itself, made audible. The dowager sat near the fire, in the position of a woman who has not come to observe but to confirm. Edmund sat at the table with the pen beside him, and the particular remoteness of a man performing a duty he did not enjoy. Reginald spoke at some length about Clara's eventual benefit from a consolidated estate, and about the inconvenience of divided properties, and his voice had the texture of genuine conviction, because he had been saying these things to himself for long enough that he believed them. Hale read the document. Wren stood at the wall with the tray. When Hale reached the clause describing the date and circumstance of Margaret Caro's death, he read with professional exactitude, naming the 10th of November, 1805, of complications following a premature confinement, the attending physician one Dr. Giro. Aldous Crisp, the record filed with the parish of St. Catherine's in Wiltshire. There was not at that time any doubt in the room that this was true. "She cannot testify," Hale said smoothly and without apparent cause, glancing toward Wren with a professional disregard that was its own kind of statement. She cannot speak. She is irrelevant to these proceedings. Edmund frowned slightly at the phrasing, though he did not appear to understand its implication. Wren's hand tightened on the tray. The word was not a decision. It came the way breath comes when something has been held too long. It came the way the Arctic tern returns across all that distance to the place it started. Liar. The room stopped. In the chaos that followed, several things happened, in an order that Wren could not afterward perfectly reconstruct. The tray fell. Reginald rose from his chair. Edmund looked at her with the entirely focused gray eyes she had seen only once before, in the library doorway. Hale said something in a carrying voice about female instability and the legal weight of undocumented testimony. Wren went to the desk by the window, took the pen, and wrote on the back of an unfolded letter that was lying there. The physician's name is wrong. Dr. Crisp died in the autumn of 1803. He could not have attended in November of 1805. The real attending physician was a doctor. Smythe of Marlborough brought privately, and the record filed at St. Catherine's was signed in a hand that is not a vicar's. I know because I was in this house on that morning. I was 15 years old, and employed here under my mother's supervision. I have the brooch Lady Ashwick gave me through the solar room door before your mother and Mr. Hale arrived. Your wife was alive when that document was signed. She died 4 years ago. In Derbyshire, she placed the letter on the table in front of Edmund and stepped back. The room was very quiet. Edmund read it. He read it again. He looked up at Hale, whose face had become the face of a man whose footing has given way on ground he was certain of. He looked at Reginald, who had sat back down with a slightly diminished expression. He looked at the dowager, who had turned her face toward the fire and was looking into it with the expression of someone counting an exit. Then he looked at Wren. "You have been here 2 years," he said. His voice was the level voice she had heard correct Mrs. Alderton about the word deaf-mute. "You have been here 2 years, and you knew this." She did not look away. She had prepared for this. She met his gaze, and held it. "She should have spoken," Reginald said, recovering. "She's invented this. It's a servant's fantasy." Edmund said nothing. He looked at Wren. "Why did you not speak sooner?" he said. It was not quite a question. Wren reached into the collar of her gown and unpinned the brooch from where it had rested for 10 years. She placed it on the table beside the letter. It was small and silver gray and shaped like a bird in flight. He looked at it for a long moment. "You were 15, he said. She nodded. "And they told you," he stopped. His jaw was tight. "They told you what would happen if you spoke." She nodded again. He said very quietly, "Get out of my house." And the room heard it, and went still, and Wren understood that he was not speaking to her. Reginald and Hale left within the hour, the document unsigned. Reginald said something to his mother in passing, low and quick, and the dowager received it without expression, which was itself a kind of expression. She remained in the drawing-room for some time after her son had been escorted from the premises, sitting very straight in the chair by the fire with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. And then she rose, slowly, with the measured deliberateness of a woman who will not be seen to hurry, and was gone before dinner. Hale's clerks took their cases, and disappeared into the gray October afternoon without ceremony. Clara came down the stairs at 4 o'clock with her notebook and found the drawing-room empty, and Wren in the entrance hall with her traveling case. Clara wrote very quickly. "Where are you going?" Wren pointed at the door. P. Clara's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, all of them eloquent. Clara wrote, "You cannot go. You are the only person in this house who talks to me." Wren looked at the notebook and then at Clara, and the grief of it pressed against the back of her eyes. In a way she was accustomed to managing and found. Today she could not manage in the usual manner. She knelt, so they were at the same height, and touched Clara's cheek, gently with the backs of her fingers. Behind Clara at the top of the stairs Edmund appeared. He came down slowly. He had the brooch in his hand. He stopped 2 steps from the bottom. "Put it down," he said, not coldly, with the particular voice of a command that is also a plea, the voice he used when Clara was about to do something that would require him to worry about her. "You are not leaving this house today." Wren looked at him. She looked at the brooch in his hand. She looked at her case on the floor. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "And considerably more than that. I will not explain myself in the entrance hall." He came down the last 2 steps. He held out the brooch to her. "Will you come into the study?" It was the first time in 2 years that he had spoken to her as though her answer might vary. She picked up the case and set it aside, and followed him. In the study, with the fire lit and the October dark pressing at the windows, Edmund poured 2 glasses of brandy and set one before her and sat across the desk and told her what he knew. He had not known. He said this plainly, and with the particular weight of a man for whom the statement carries no relief. He had genuinely not known, and the coldness she had observed in him toward his wife had been guilt and distance rather than contempt. And he had spent 10 years believing he had failed a woman he could not now properly mourn because the particulars of the failure were all he had, instead of grief. He said, "I do not know yet what this means legally. I will need time to understand what Hale has done and what Reginald has done and what my mother has done." He paused. "I imagine you have known about my mother's part in this for the full 10 years. She reached for the pen on his desk and wrote across a margin. The Dowager was the one who told Hale to bring the physician. The Dowager was the one who received the parish record. She did not know whether the Dowager had known Margaret was still living afterward, or whether Hale had managed that independently. He read it. "She knew," he said, not with the anger she might have expected with something heavier. She would have known. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I understand if you do not answer." He looked at her directly, the gray eyes that were accustomed to distance now entirely close. "Have you kept silent this long because of what they threatened you with, or because you did not trust that speaking would produce justice rather than only cost?" Wren looked at the pen. She thought about this honestly, which she had not permitted herself to do before. She wrote the word both. He nodded. He said, "I am sorry." He said it plainly, without the elaborate machinery of aristocratic apology. "I am sorry you spent 10 years in that silence on behalf of a household that had already failed you." Her hand was on the desk between them. He looked at it for a moment. His own hand moved, and she thought he would touch it, and instead he placed the pewter brooch beside it on the desk, and left it there, and the distance he kept was deliberate and respectful. And she understood both the restraint and what it was restraining. She took the brooch and fastened it again, at the inside of her collar, where it belonged. They sat in the study for another hour, and she answered his questions in writing. And at some point he began to speak as though she were simply a person he was talking to, rather than a person he was extracting information from, and the difference was significant. And she felt it in the particular warmth that had no name she was prepared to give it. Hale was investigated and dismissed from practice within the year, after Edmund presented the evidence Wren had provided, corroborated by a search of the parish record at St. Catherine's and the discovery of the late doctor. Crisp's death certificate predating the document by 2 full years. Mr. Pemberton Hale protested loudly and at length, and was not believed. Reginald withdrew his claim on Meridew House and removed himself to the family property in Norfolk, where he was said to be baffled and aggrieved in equal measure. The Dowager spent a season in Bath and returned to her own establishment with the understanding, communicated between Edmund and his mother without any witness, and with the particular compression of a family conversation that covers enormous ground in very few words, that her management of Edmund's household and Clara's future were concluded. Meridew House was confirmed as Clara's. She received this information at breakfast one morning in February, with the same solemnity with which she received most significant things, and then went to the library to write Wren a note about it. The note asked in Clara's deliberate handwriting whether Wren was the reason her father said Meridew House now belonged to her properly. Wren considered the question. She wrote back that her father was the reason. He had listened. Clara folded this and put it in the small box she kept in the library for things she considered important. There was a week in late January, after the legal business had settled into its slower machinery, and before the county had entirely decided what it thought about the unraveling of an event most of them had not known was a lie when the house was very quiet. Clara was at lessons. The staff went about their work in the measured rhythm that a well-ordered house produces. Snow had been falling since the night before, and the grounds were altered, softer, simplified. The stone walls emerging from the white, as though the estate had been drawn in charcoal with most of the detail removed. Wren was in the library when Edmund came in. He did not knock. He had taken to not knocking when he came to the library, because knocking on a library door felt, to him, apparently, like an unnecessary formality between adults who had spent the previous 3 months in regular, frank conversation. This was new, between them. The frankness. It had grown up slowly in the weeks since October, like a plant that required no dramatic watering but simply the correct conditions, no pretense, no performance, no assumption that she could not hold an opinion or that he was not interested in it. He came in and stood at the window with his hands linked behind him, looking at the snow. "You spoke again yesterday," he said to Clara. "In the hall." She mentioned it. Wren waited. He turned from the window. Does it come and go? The speaking. She reached for the slate, which she still carried by habit, though she had used it less and less in the weeks since October. She wrote on the slate that it came when she trusted the room, that she had not trusted any room for 10 years. He read this. He looked at her with the particular stillness she had come to understand was not absence, but its opposite, full attention gathered and contained. "Do you trust this room?" he said. She looked at him. At the snow light from the window. At the fire to her left, and the books to her right, and the natural history volume, still on the shelf where she had been reading from the Arctic turn passage in September, when she had not known he was at the door. She said, "Yes." Her voice in the quiet library had the quality of something spoken for the first time, though it was not the first time. It was simply the first time she had said a word in this house that was not a defense or a disclosure, but simply the truth of the present moment, offered freely and without cost. He crossed the room. He stopped a proper distance away, the distance of a man who is being careful because what he does next cannot be unmade. And she recognized the deliberate quality of the hesitation because she had seen it in him before, in the study in October, when his hand had moved toward hers and had stopped and left the brooch instead. "I have a question," he said, "and I would like you to answer it as honestly as you answer everything." She waited. "Is the silence something you wish to keep?" he said, "or something you kept because you were given no other option?" She thought about this. She thought about the Arctic turn and its impossible migration which science could not explain, carried out year after year by a creature that did not question it, because the impulse to return was simply part of what it was to be that creature. She said, "I would like to try talking." Not a declaration, not a performance. Simply what was true. He took one step closer and stopped again, and the expression on his face was the one she had not had a name for in the library doorway in September, and had one for now. It was the face of a man who was not expected to have anything, and has been given something, and is trying to receive it without breaking it. He said we could begin with dinner if you would come downstairs. It was an invitation framed as practicality, which was his way. She had learned his way over 2 years and 3 months, and one November morning, and one afternoon in the study with the fire lit. She had learned that his commands were protection, and his invitations were want, and that the difference between what he said and what he meant was simply the distance left for her to cross, if she chose to. She said, "I will come downstairs." He said, "Good." And it was not the word she might have chosen to mark the moment, but it was his word, and it was warm. Clara came to the library that afternoon in the blue-gray dress and the pinafore and informed them both, with the authority of a child who considers herself a reliable narrator of domestic affairs, that she had already told Mrs. Missitandi. Fenwick there would be 3 at dinner, so there was no need to discuss it further. Edmund looked at Wren over Clara's head with an expression that was as close to amusement as she had ever seen on his face, and her heart did the thing it had been quietly doing, since September, and she let it. That night, the fire in the dining room was lit before 5 o'clock, and the snow continued to fall outside the long windows, and Clara ate her dinner with the contentment of someone whose world has been satisfactorily arranged. Edmund spoke about the spring drainage work on the East Field, and Wren responded with 2 sentences about the natural history of marsh sedge that she had read recently, and Clara interjected with a question about whether birds ever got cold, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do when a household has found its proper shape. After Clara was settled and the house had quieted, Wren stood at the library window with a candle and watched the snow come down into the dark grounds, covering everything softly, making the lawn smooth, and the stone walls clean and the whole world simpler than it had been. She reached into her collar and touched the small pewter brooch. She had carried it as a burden for 10 years. A secret, a debt, a proof of something she had not been ready to say. It was still those things in its history. It was also the thing Margaret had pressed into the hand of a frightened girl through a door, not as accusation, not as obligation, but as the small gift one woman gives another when there is nothing else to give. Something that said I was here and I was real, and someone will know it. Behind her, she heard a step in the corridor. Edmund paused at the open door. He did not speak immediately. She did not turn. They had learned between them that silence did not require filling. After a moment he said, "You should sleep. The cold will have the pipes working hard tonight, and Mrs. Fenwick will want all hands early." "I know," she said. A pause. 2 breaths. "The snow still falling, Wren," he said. She turned. He was in the doorway with the candle from the corridor in his hand and the snowlight from outside, making the room very still. And the expression on his face was the one from the library in September, and the study in October, and the entrance hall the day she had tried to leave, all of them resolving now into something definite. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he has decided on. He said, "I am glad you came back to this house." She held the candle. The small bird in pewter was warm beneath her fingertips. "So am I," she said. The snow came down outside. Somewhere in the east wing, Clara slept. The fire in the dining room had burned to its final warmth, and Ashrick Court settled around them, old stone and old silence in one lit window, with the quiet permanence of a place that has finally been told the truth.